Hi, my name is Xavier. In this video, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of how you can use gradient maps in Photoshop to add color to images that contain a wide range of values. Along with this, I'll show you a quick example of how you can use gradient maps for hand-painted textures in 3D art. So, let's do this thing. In Photoshop, go to File, New, and create a new blank image at any size you like. Now, if you don't want to create a new image, you can also use a grayscale image of any sort, such as a photograph. I'm going to fill this new image with clouds and a few scribbles, so it'll have a nice range of values in it. Now, ideally, any image you're working on when using gradient maps will have a large range of values, all the way from very dark to very bright, and anywhere in between. Now that I have some values to play with, I'm going to open up the Adjustment Layers menu and select Gradient Map. Gradient maps can also be accessed through Image, Adjustments, Gradient Map. Now the advantage to using an adjustment layer instead of using the option right over here is that you retain full control of how your gradient map is applied to your image. If you have an adjustment layer, you can control its opacity, you can control how it's masked off, you can even select different blending modes such as lighten, screen, multiply, anything like that. Anything you can find on this menu. So now that I have my gradient map adjustment layer, I'll just click on the gradient map to make sure it's selected, and the gradient map options will appear in the adjustments panel. Now if I want to edit the gradient map, I'll click on the gradient right here, and the gradient editor will pop up. Now this is the same gradient editor that pops up when you select the gradient tool, and then click on the preview gradient right here. See? Same thing. Now the gradient editor consists of two main areas. The top, with all its various buttons and preset gradients and that kind of thing, and the bottom, where you're actually going to be doing most of your work. Now at the top of the lower area, there's a drop-down box that lets you select from two separate kinds of gradients. There's the solid gradients, right here, and there's the noise gradients. I'm going to be focusing on solid gradients in this video. Now below that, you'll find a smoothness slider. This controls the attenuation of colors in your gradient. It's not a very noticeable effect unless your gradient has a lot of different colors. And I suggest that, you just play around with it. Try a few of these different presets and see what happens. Now below that, you can see a large preview of your gradient with various handles here, 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 and here called stops that let you adjust the color and opacity of your gradient. The stops on top let you adjust the opacity, and the stops on bottom let you adjust color. Now in the case of gradient maps, opacity really isn't important. Opacity only becomes important if you're using the gradient tool. I can give you a little demonstration of that right now. I'll just create a new layer, select the gradient tool, and select a gradient that has varying opacity. So there you go. That's an example of how opacity can work in a gradient. But that never actually shows up when you're using gradient maps, because gradient maps only take into account the actual color of the map and not the opacity of it. So, this large preview gradient represents the range of values in your image, from darkest over here on the left to brightest over here on the right. In the middle, obviously, you have all the midtones. Finally, below the preview gradient, you can see a section labeled Stops. The stops area gives you control over what colors appear in which parts of the gradient. If you want to take advantage of the stops area, you need to first select or create a stop. To select a stop and start editing it, you just simply click on it, like this. Now, you can just click on it and all the appropriate controls for that stop will be displayed. The ones on the bottom correspond to, of course, the stops on the bottom of the gradient, and the ones on the top corresponds to the stops on the top of the gradient. Now you can't delete any of these stops right now because at least two stops are required for both opacity and color to create a gradient. So these are mandatory. You can't get rid of these. However, you can edit them. But if you do want to make more stops, you can do that simply by clicking above or below the gradient, like this. Now new stops inherit the color of the last stop you selected. In this case, black. I selected black previously, so it made a new black gradient stop for me. Now notice that when I placed a new black stop right here in the middle of my image, or the middle of my gradient, excuse me, the image gets very dark and it almost looks like you did a levels adjustment to it. This is because a portion of the midtone have been replaced by black with this new stop. I put it right where the midtones are in this gradient, so all those midtones got replaced by black. Now this property of gradient maps is actually what we'll be taking advantage of to replace the colors in our image with those in a gradient map. If a stop I'd placed had been a bright red, like this, all those colors, all those midtones would have been replaced by that bright red color. Now you can place a lot of different stops and they can be edited by simply clicking below the gradient like so, and editing their color by clicking this little swatch right here, or you can double click on the stops themselves to bring out the color picker. So that's basically it. That's the basics of how gradient maps work. This gradient right here represents your values in your image, and these stops let you control how those values are replaced by colors. So now that you get that, let's do a practical example. So this is a texture I created for the Mutant League challenge on Polycount. And as you can see, it's very colorful and it has a really wide range of values, but I'm not satisfied with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some gradient maps, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to make a gradient map for this halftone pattern right here, and then for the rest of the purple areas. So I'm going to control click on the layer that has the halftone pattern to select it, and now I'm going to create a new gradient map. Now since that layer was selected, there was a selection active when I created the gradient map, it automatically got masked off so it only affects that area. I'm going to make another gradient map by control clicking and then inverting the selection by pressing Shift Control I, or going to select inverse, and I'm going to create a new gradient map that will affect everything else in the image. Now that I have these two gradient maps, I can proceed to very quickly create new color schemes for this guy. So let's try it out. Let's give that halftone pattern a nice yellow color. We'll start out with kind of a dark brownish yellow for the shadows, and then give them a really hot yellow for the highlights. Oops. Oh, it looks like I screwed up a little. It doesn't matter. Let's go back. There we go. So we have a nice gradient that goes from dark brownish to light yellow, and I can adjust where this affects. And you can do the exact same thing with this one. You can do a dark red, and well, let's see. How about a bright pink? And now you have an entirely new color scheme for your character in just a couple of simple steps. And of course you can add more and more colors in there to adjust how cool the shadows are, or how hot the highlights are. But that's basically it. An entirely new color scheme created in just a few simple steps in just a couple of seconds by screwing with gradient maps. I hope you found this video informative and interesting, and if you did, please feel free to leave some comments or questions or anything in the comments below, and you can contact me through some of my information in the video description. Thanks! Have a good one.